Welcome to the English BookCast. Today, we're embarking on a really fascinating and I'd say historically charged deep dive.
hmm
We're looking into The Black Pope, A History of the Jesuits by M.F. Cusack.
Right.
And listeners might know Cusack from her other identity as the Nun of Kenmare. She wrote quite a bit, didn't she? Things like her autobiography, Life Inside the Church of Rome.
Yes, and the truth about convent life. So she comes to this topic with a very specific and quite critical background perspective on the Catholic Church. This book is definitely an examination of the Society of Jesus.
Absolutely. And that title, The Black Pope, it's provocative right away.
It is. And Cusack explains that, in Catholic circles, it's often used for the general of the Jesuits, that visual contrast, black robes versus the Pope's white.
Okay.
But she pushes it further. She brings it this other interpretation, this idea that the general, because of the Jesuits' power, actually kind of rules the white Pope.
Wow, okay. So governing the Pope himself.
That's the implication she highlights. She even mentions Cardinal Manning's life as sort of evidence for this view being out there. It immediately tells you we're diving into power, influence, deep church politics.
It definitely grabs your attention. Now, before we dive deeper, just a quick reminder to our listeners. If you enjoy these explorations, please do consider joining the English BookCast channel and maybe share the videos. It really helps us grow.
Yeah, absolutely. We appreciate the support.
So this book was published back in 1896, and Cusack is pretty upfront about her aim, isn't she?
Oh, yes. She wants to dissect the Jesuits' historical impact, and she makes no bones about believing it's been, well, detrimental, harmful to both Catholic and Protestant countries, in her view.
She doesn't hold back. She throws us right in, mentioning Pope Clement XIII's condemnation.
Right, the quote is powerful. Far from being any comfort to the Holy See or any advantage to the Christian world. That's the Pope talking about the Jesuits.
It's pretty damning. And she mentions a letter, too, from Père Lachaise.
Yes, to Father Peter, another Jesuit. She teases it as this remarkable letter, hinting at, hidden plans or methods. It sets a tone of intrigue right from the start.
So by starting with Clement's suppression in the 1770s and this hint of secret letters, she's framing them as this influential, maybe even covert force that caused problems even within the church.
Exactly. And she states her goal is to explore their role in how the Church of Rome changed over the last couple of centuries, and even connect them back to the predisposing causes of the Reformation. She sees them as central players, not just some side group.
Okay, central players. Now, Cusack then rewinds, takes us right back to the beginning, the origins, and she sets up this really stark contrast.
Between Martin Luther and Ignatius Loyola, two giants of the 16th century.
And how does she portray them? Let's get into that foundational comparison. Luther first.
She presents Luther as championing, quote, light and spiritual freedom, driven by the Bible, seeking that direct connection with Christ.
Okay, driven by Scripture, and Loyola.
Loyola, in her view, is the opposite, the architect of new chains for the enslaving of the human race spiritually and intellectually. That's her phrasing.
Wow, strong word.
Very. She emphasizes their motivations were fundamentally different. Luther's was theological salvation by faith, Scripture's authority. Loyola's, according to Cusack, started more from wanting worldly fame, first as a soldier.
Right, his military background.
And then, after his injury, wanting fame as a saint, inspired by reading Lives of Saints, the Virgin Mary, not so much deep theology initially. This difference is key to her whole argument.
That injury really was pivotal then. She goes into his military life, his indifference to pain if his pride was involved.
Yes, she details that. And the battle wound forced him out of the army, redirected that ambition towards religion. There's a sense in her writing that it was the same drive for glory, just shifted to a different arena.
A continuation, just on a spiritual battlefield instead of a physical one.
That's exactly the picture she paints. Ambition finding a new path when the old one closed. Very different from Luther, who she sees as driven by theological conviction, wanting to make Christ known through Scripture. Not about founding an order devoted to Mary, which is how she frames Loyola's path.
She even mentions him putting on the livery of the Virgin Mary.
Right, while Luther put on the whole armor of God. Symbolic contrast she uses quite effectively.
And their early spiritual practices also very different.
Markedly so, according to Cusack. She describes Loyola's intense asceticism, the fasting, the self-flagellation, the visions.
But she notes these didn't bring him peace.
Correct. In fact, she suggests a link. The more physical suffering, the more visions, implying they might have been, self-induced or psychologically driven rather than purely divine.
Interesting point.
And this contrasts sharply with Luther's big breakthrough. The just shall live by faith. Cusack hammers this home. Luther found peace through faith in Christ's sacrifice. Loyola's early path was self-punishment and mystical experiences. That difference for her shapes everything that follows.
It's quite something how she uses these early biographies to build her case against the entire Jesuit order later on. She even includes that weird story. The ghost?
Ah, yes, the ghost of the ironmonger. Eustache Moubon.
What was that about? Why include something so strange?
Well, Cusack uses it, I think, to show the religious atmosphere of the time. An atmosphere she felt was prone to superstition, maybe even deliberate manipulation of belief.
Okay.
By showing how easily a seemingly normal event could be twisted into a miracle for the Virgin Mary, she gives context for how Loyola's ideas might have gained traction. It underscores her skepticism about miracle claims and how piety could be, well, exploited.
That makes sense. It sets a scene. So moving on, the book follows Loyola into his studies grammar school, University of Alcala, but he wasn't exactly a star student.
According to Cusack, no. She suggests he really struggled with theology and logic, maybe beyond his limited intelligence, as she puts it rather harshly. Yeah. But she does credit him with a real knack for attracting people, especially young men, getting followers for his cause. This focus on building a following, maybe more than deep scholarly work, is something she keeps coming back to.
And this attracted suspicion fairly quickly. The whole Alumbrado or Illuminati accusation, that sounds pretty loaded.
It does. And Cusack explores the murky origins of this group, suggesting possible links to esoteric ideas, maybe even Buddhism, through the spiritual exercises. She even brings in von Hammer's theory, connecting Loyola to the Assassins, another group sometimes linked to the term Illuminati.
Wow. So these weren't just later criticisms. People were suspicious early on.
Yes. Cusack stresses that the Alumbrado accusation came from priests in Alcala during Loyola's time. It wasn't just a Protestant invention later. There were contemporary worries about his methods and orthodoxy. She feels these potential links, maybe between Spanish mysticism and Eastern ideas, haven't been explored enough.
And this led to actual trouble with the Inquisition.
It did. He was imprisoned for a time. Cusack notes he was cleared of outright heresy, but he was definitely scolded for theological ignorance and told not to preach until he knew more.
And he had to change his clothes and leave town.
Essentially, yes. Change his distinctive dress, go to another university. Cusack emphasizes this. The things that got the Jesuits kicked out of countries later. The roots of that suspicion and those controversial practices were there right from the start in Loyola's own lifetime.
So ambition, controversy, quite a beginning. Now let's move to the formal establishment of the order. Cusack says it wasn't exactly a smooth ride.
No, definitely not. She describes quite a bit of resistance, especially from the established order, Dominicans, Franciscans.
What was their issue?
They apparently accused Loyola and his group of being secret allies of the German reformers, which Cusack herself calls obviously absurd.
Right.
But it shows how potent slander could be, how easily accusations stick, even ridiculous ones.
But he overcame this opposition eventually. How did he manage that?
Cusack highlights a couple of things. There was a bad famine in Rome, which gave Loyola a chance to organize charity work, hitting up the rich to help the poor. Good PR, essentially.
Okay, seizing an opportunity.
Yes, but she also points to a darker tactic, his efforts to convert Jews. She claims he did this by denying them medical help unless they saw a Catholic priest first.
Seriously, that sounds unethical.
Cusack calls it the start of the society's unchristian diplomacy. It's a very harsh judgment on their early methods.
It certainly is. And she also mentions him strategically getting friendly with influential women in Rome.
Right. She suggests Loyola was smart enough to see the power these women held in society. Getting their support meant connections, money, social standing, all crucial for getting his new order off the ground against the existing resistance.
The whole process of getting papal approval back then, Cusack touches on canonization too, doesn't she? Making saints. What's her take on that?
She brings a rather cynical view, noting the often significant cost involved in getting someone canonized. It leads her to question, well, how much heavenly power these saints really had if their earthly recognition depended so much on money and influence. She frames it as a known Roman Catholic fact, linking it to paying for masses for souls in purgatory.
So suggesting status could be bought to some extent.
That's the implication. But after navigating all this, showing his influence, Loyola finally gets the Pope's okay. How did that happen?
Pope Paul III initially seemed impressed, right? The finger of God is here.
Yes, that famous quote. But Cusack notes Loyola was wary. He'd faced suspicion before. He didn't just want verbal approval. He pushed for a formal, written papal bull to make it official and legally secure.
Smart move, given his history.
Definitely. And that led to the actual bull, Regimini Militantis Ecclesiae, September 27, 1540, the official founding document.
And why did it happen relatively easily in the end, despite the earlier doubts?
Cusack gives two main reasons. First, the huge threat from the Reformation in Germany, the Church, was losing ground and needed loyal defenders.
A pragmatic need for allies.
Exactly. And second, the perception that some older religious orders had become, well, lax in their discipline and morals. The Jesuits, with their vows of chastity and apparent holiness, looked like a fresh, disciplined force.
So, the right group at the right time, promising reform and loyalty to the Pope. Okay, let's dig into those core principles. What does Cusack say was the Jesuits' central aim?
According to her reading of their constitutions, the absolute core aim was total, unquestioning service to the Pope, directly under his command. She points to a specific clause emphasizing this direct obedience.
But this vow of obedience, Cusack argues it's not quite that simple. There's a power dynamic.
Right, this is a really critical point she makes. While the vow seems to put Jesuits directly under the Pope, she argues that practically speaking, a Jesuit only obeys the Pope if the general tells them to.
So the general acts as a gatekeeper for papal commands.
Effectively, yes. This intermediary role, Cusack claims, gives the general immense practical power. She even suggests the Pope becomes somewhat dependent on the general to get things done through the Jesuit network.
That's a pretty radical interpretation of their structure. And she goes further, saying the general basically replaces God and conscience for the Jesuits under him.
She does. She quotes Jesuit texts emphasizing that members are forbidden to question superiors, even if an order seems wrong or against divine law. Questioning is portrayed as a grave sin within their system.
How does she compare this to, say, a soldier's obedience?
She draws a clear line.
Yeah.
A soldier obeys lawful orders, but there's usually a code, maybe channels to question an unlawful order. And crucially, disobedient doesn't typically mean eternal damnation.
Okay.
But Jesuit obedience, as Cusack presents it, is deeply spiritualized. Questioning authority has eternal weight. She sees it as an extreme form of spiritual control.
And they were given extraordinary privileges by popes, too.
Yes, she lists quite a few. Things like ordaining priests with less scrutiny, having free access to churches everywhere, being exempt from church taxes, and instantly owning any donations made to them.
Instant ownership.
Yep. Cusack even wonders aloud if this was some kind of hypnotism the society exerted on popes, getting them to grant all these special favors.
That's a provocative thought. And to maintain control internally, she describes a system of, well, she calls it espionage.
A very tight system. Novices needing permission for visitors, and a superior always present during those visits. All letters, in and out, read by superiors.
Why so strict?
Cusack argues it was designed to stamp out any independent thought or dissent, and to make members completely dependent on their superiors for information and guidance. Total control.
Now, the spiritual exercises of Loyola, they're famous. How does she see their purpose?
Outwardly, they're meditations on scripture and religious themes. But Cusack argues their real goal is to instill that unquestioning obedience, to mold individuals into perfect tools for the order's aims.
And they use these widely, not just for Jesuits.
Yes, in retreats, in their schools, even adapted versions for children. She sees it as a pervasive method for shaping minds according to their blueprint.
She specifically mentions the meditation on hell. Why?
She views it as psychological manipulation, using graphic depictions of hell to induce intense fear, making novices promise things out of terror, perhaps before they can really think clearly about the commitment. She sees it as fitting that end justifies the means philosophy she attributes to them.
And she touches on extreme piety, too, like counting Christ's wounds.
Yes, practices like that. She suggests this intense focus on suffering could lead members to inflict suffering on themselves, linking it to historical self-flagellation practices and even comparing it to Hindu fakirs.
So a picture emerges of intense discipline, absolute obedience, and very specific methods to shape members. Let's shift to education and influence. Cusack first tackles a common idea about the Jesuits.
Right, the misconception that they're somehow separate from the main Catholic Church.
And she says,
absolutely not. She insists they operate fully under papal authority. Especially after papal infallibility was defined, the Pope is ultimately responsible for their teachings. She details the rigorous approval process for any Jesuit publication that goes through the order, then the Pope via the Inquisition. Very tightly controlled.
so if we want to understand Jesuit teaching, Where does Cusack say we should look?
She points to three main areas. First, their own published writings, especially moral theology. Second, accounts from reliable historians, including Jesuits themselves. And third, criticisms from Catholics who were educated by Jesuits but stayed in the church people, like Lord Petre or Count von Hoensbroech. They offer an informed, if critical, perspective.
She mentions one of these critics, Lucien Gleis. What was his observation about their education?
Gleis, having spent 12 years in Jesuit schools, felt their focus was just imparting set knowledge, not developing real critical thinking. Cusack quotes him, "The Jesuit does not educate, he merely teaches," just pouring in facts.
Implying passive learning.
Exactly. And she adds that anecdote about Bishop de Maintenon, the pious but stupid student. The piety will vanish and the stupidity will remain. A sharp critique about prioritizing rote learning over intellect.
That's telling. Cusack also critiques their use of saints as role models in schools.
Yes, her issue is that the saints often held up were extreme ascetics, withdrawn from the world. Fine models, maybe, for someone joining the order, but hardly practical or even healthy examples for lay students who need to live and work in society.
She questioned the suitability for everyday life.
Precisely.
What about the general atmosphere in Jesuit schools? Discipline.
She describes it as very rigid, constant supervision, discouraging close friendships, using harsh punishments. She thinks this could breed resentment and maybe stifle emotional development. Plus, limits on reading novels banned, books censored, and not much freedom for recreation.
Sounds quite restrictive. What was the goal of all this control over education, according to Cusack?
She argues their aim was total control, keeping even lay Catholics from having much say in their children's education. She even cites Cardinals Wiseman and Manning complaining about the selfishness of religious orders, Jesuits included, in hoarding educational control.
And she uses Stonyhurst College as an example of the results.
Yeah, she looks at a list of famous men educated there and finds it unimpressive. A general nobody heard of, an admiral who didn't know how to relax, a comic paper editor stifled by church censorship. Her point is that this controlled system maybe doesn't produce truly great or independent minds.
And these strict rules weren't just for students, they applied to Jesuits themselves.
Oh, yes. She lists rules from a 1607 publication. Strict rules about reading forbidden books, need permission, monitoring all mail, learning local languages, even how they slept or kept their doors. Rules for the doorman, rules about copying letters, using code for confidential stuff, yes. Then she adds an account from someone who lived in a French Jesuit novitiate. Early rising, every minute scheduled, testing tempers, mandatory silence, prescribed studies, even bizarre practices like the lapidarium symbolic stoning. It just reinforces the image of pervasive control at every level.
It really does paint a picture of intense internal regulation. Okay, let's switch gears to loyalty and political intrigue. This is a big theme for Cusack. She starts with that fundamental question for Catholics. Loyalty to the state versus loyalty to the Pope, especially after papal infallibility.
Right. She sees it as a really tricky position. Can a Catholic truly be loyal to both crown and pope if their demands clash? She brings up Cardinal Manning again, saying there were basically two types of Catholics in England, Queen first and Pope first. That division worries her.
And she points to seeming contradictions in church teaching on infallibility itself.
Yeah, she mentions Father Waterworth in 1846 saying the Pope was fallible outside specific conditions, then compares that to the stronger definition after the Vatican Council. She even notes an old catechism calling papal infallibility a Protestant invention, a question later removed without explanation. These shifts, for her, show the complexity and maybe inconsistency around papal power.
She also quotes Archbishop Manning directly on the Pope's temporal power.
Yes, asserting the Pope's inherent right to depose kings. Manning apparently saw this not as something acquired, but as part of Christ's own authority vested in the Pope. All Christians, therefore, had to obey papal decrees, even in governing matters. That's a huge claim of power.
A claim Cusack clearly finds problematic. She also mentions Pope Pius IX's syllabus of errors.
His condemnation of things like freedom of the press, conscience, worship, speech, plus asserting that church courts were immune from civil law, and excommunicating anyone who sued clergy in secular courts or passed laws infringing church rights. She sees this as fundamentally opposing modern democratic values.
So, given all this, how does she view Catholic emancipation in England?
She sees it as never fully resolving that core issue of divided loyalty. Could Catholics be fully trusted subjects when the Pope claimed such sweeping authority over rulers and nations? For her, emancipation didn't settle that fundamental tension.
She then discusses a specific Jesuit scheme for the Romanizing of England. What was that about?
She points to an 1889 article in the Jesuit magazine The Month, which she reads as a blueprint based on Father Parsons' older plans from Elizabeth I's time. It apparently included instructions for influencing elections, bishops vetting candidates, requiring public Catholic oaths for office holders. The goal, she claims, was ultimately a Catholic king and parliament.
And what was the Jesuit view on obeying civil laws in general, according to Cusack?
She quotes the Weekly Register, which she links to Jesuit views, saying they basically obey laws they like and defy ones they don't, suggesting a very conditional loyalty to the state.
She recounts their expulsions from various countries, and Pope Clement IV ends suppressing the whole society in 1773.
Yes, kicked out of France, Canada, then the Pope's bull forever suppressing them. But, as she notes, they were revived fairly quickly in 1814. She also mentions ongoing fights, like over Jesuit estates in Canada, and their maneuvering to get influence and funding back after the suppression.
And she gives examples of more recent papal interference in politics.
A couple, yes. The Marquis de Breteuil resigning in France due to Vatican policy, and the case of Prince Boris in Bulgaria involving parental rights versus church law over the child's religion. For Cusack, these show the church consistently prioritizing its own rules and perceived rights over national sovereignty or even parental rights.
Finally, on this topic, she quotes some old church decretals.
Yes, historical ones asserting the church's right not just to excommunicate heretics, but potentially to put them to death, though usually after a chance to convert. These highlight a past where the church claimed immense temporal power over life and death based on belief.
These are certainly heavy historical claims about political power. Now, let's move into the controversial area of Jesuit moral theology. Cusack gives some examples that sound quite shocking.
She does. She mentions Jesuit theologians like Henriques allegedly justifying a priest killing the husband of his adulterous wife,
Whoa.
and Slattle apparently approving retaliatory murder if someone disgraced you. She presents these as evidence of a disturbingly flexible, maybe dangerous ethical system in some Jesuit thinking.
She also brings up a letter from Bishop Palafox to Pope Innocent X. What did that reveal?
According to Cusack's reading, Palafox's letter pointing to deliberate secrecy within the order, suggesting that many Jesuits, especially those who hadn't taken the final fourth vow, were kept in the dark about the order's true principles, its internal structure, its privileges. Only the inner circle knew everything.
Interesting. Given this history and these alleged teachings, Cusack asks a pointed question about Jesuits in England at her time.
Yes, she basically asks, considering their history of plotting against English monarchs, is it really wise to encourage them in England now, implying their past behavior might resurface?
And the issue of truthfulness, mental reservation, or equivocation. Can you explain those again?
Sure. Cusack describes these as ways to mislead without technically lying. Mental reservation is mentally adding a silent condition that changes the meaning of your spoken words. Equivocation is using ambiguous words that can be understood in different ways. She gives examples of how someone could swear an oath but secretly mean something else entirely.
Like the example of the priest and the tenant withholding rent.
Right. The idea is the priest blesses the tenant's action, keeping rent for essentials, while perhaps holding a mental reservation based on the tenant's desperate need, justifying what looks like condoning theft or breach of contract. It's presented as a kind of moral loophole.
And what's the Jesuit justification for stealing that she mentions?
She quotes an argument that stealing out of absolute necessity, for yourself or another, is justifiable because, in that dire situation, the goods are almost considered common property, and taking them is like an act of charity, reframing theft as potentially virtuous under extreme duress.
She also presents that dilemma with the nun in the hospital and the dying Protestant patient asking for his own minister.
Yes, a complex situation. Should the Catholic nun facilitate this, potentially violating her institution's rules but showing compassion? Or should she adhere strictly to her religious duty as defined by your church? It highlights potential conflicts between rules and basic humanity.
And finally, on moral theology, she briefly touches on sins of chastity, using a really disturbing case.
Yeah, the case of Niembauer, that Bavarian priest who allegedly murdered his mistress but gave her absolution as she died. Cusack claims he justified this by citing a Jesuit tutor's principle that prioritized preserving his own honor and position above all else. An extreme example used to suggest Jesuit principles could excuse even horrific acts to protect reputation. She also briefly mentions the medieval flogging mania and how Jesuits initially embraced self-flagellation intensely until authorities stepped in, though she suggests they continued it secretly.
These examples definitely paint a troubling picture of Jesuit ethics, at least as Cusack presents it. Okay, let's turn to historical events, starting with the gunpowder plot. What's Cusack's main claim here?
Unequivocal. She insists that Jesuits were the sole originators and drivers of the plot. Any denial, she says, is pointless. For her, it was a direct result of their agenda to restore Catholic power in England.
She goes back to Queen Elizabeth I and Pope Paul I again.
Yes, recounting his attempt to bribe Elizabeth into submission by offering to recognize her legitimacy if she obeyed Rome. When she refused, he excommunicated her, escalating everything.
But interestingly, she notes the secular Catholic clergy in England were initially grateful to Elizabeth.
Right. She says they appreciated her early tolerance and later blamed the Jesuits specifically for stirring up trouble and ending that period of relative peace. They saw the Jesuits as agitators.
And Cusack makes a point about the modern church canonizing people involved in these historical plots.
Yes, she finds it problematic that the church still makes saints out of figures involved in what many see as treason or violence, suggesting it implies ongoing approval, or at least a lack of condemnation, of those past actions.
Back to the gunpowder plot in James I. What was the Jesuit reaction to him, according to Cusack?
They declared him illegitimate and fully backed the plot after he banished them. She even hints at a more recent, similar Jesuit plot, though without giving details.
And she makes that very serious claim about assassination being approved in the confessional.
Yes, alleging the Jesuit confessors sometimes sanctioned the killing of enemies of the church, linking their spiritual role directly to political violence.
She contrasts the trial of the Jesuit Garnet with the Inquisition. What's the point there?
To highlight the relative openness of the English trial versus the secrecy and often brutality of the Inquisition, she also claims falsehoods were spread, supposedly by a dying man, to protect Garnet and the order, suggesting a pattern of covering things up.
She briefly mentions the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, too.
Yes, included in the context of these plots, implicitly linking it to the kind of religiously motivated violence and intrigue she associates with the Jesuits, even if she doesn't detail their specific role there.
A key point for her is Jesuit historical revisionism. What does she mean by that?
She argues they deliberately rewrite history to fit their agenda and the church's interests. This includes, she claims, suppressing or even destroying books considered heretical or critical of them. She connects this back to that alleged Jesuit plan for England, which involved controlling information.
And she contrasts Queen Elizabeth's approach to books with Queen Mary's.
Starkly. Elizabeth, she says, was lenient about possessing heretical books. Mary Bass notoriously had a law to hang anyone found with them unless they burned them immediately. Cusack also notes the ongoing Catholic desire to teach their own version of history and geography in schools.
And she mentions the Clifton Tracts dismissing persecutions under Mary as nursery fables.
Right. She sees this as a clear example of denying or minimizing historical Catholic atrocities.
Finally, on this era, she revisits the offers made to Elizabeth by the popes.
Just to reiterate that papal recognition of her legitimacy was always tied to her submitting fully to papal authority, underscoring the Church's demand for ultimate power.
So Cusack's historical view presents the Jesuits as deeply involved in political plots, using questionable means, and actively shaping the historical narrative. Let's focus now specifically on Jesuits in England. She starts by saying Catholics initially had freedom under Elizabeth.
Yes, she emphasizes that for the first 12 years there was considerable religious freedom, and Catholics at the time apparently expressed gratitude for it.
But then things got harsher. Why? According to Cusack.
She blames it squarely on the arrival and influence of the Jesuits, their restless and evil spirit, as she puts it. She believes their actions directly caused the shift from tolerance to repression.
And she contrasts England's methods with Rome's.
Right. She points out England wasn't trying to assassinate the Pope or stir up rebellion in papal lands, whereas she claims Rome, often via the Jesuits, was engaged in such plots against England.
How does she suggest the seal of confession could be misused regarding treason?
Her concern is that its absolute secrecy could shield plots. A priest might disapprove but be unable to report it due to the seal, and might even grant absolution. She cites the gunpowder plotters and Irish invincibles as possible examples of this complicity through silence.
She returns to Garnet's trial again.
Yes, focusing on his use of equivocation, arguing it was deliberate deception. She concludes he was executed for treason under law, not just for being a priest. She dismisses the miraculous straw story as legend-making.
She briefly mentions Henry III and Catherine de' Medici in France. Why bring them in here?
To draw a parallel, She highlights the political chaos and religious conflict in their France, suggesting it was similar to England's situation and that Jesuits were a major destabilizing influence in both countries.
She revisits Pope Clement IV suppressing the Jesuits. How does she frame his motives?
As a courageous act against their iniquities, done despite threats, possibly even poisoning. She notes the debate around his death, hinting foul play by Jesuit supporters was suspected. And she points out that Pius VIII later restored them without clearing them of the original charges.
She also discusses the power of the confessional itself.
Yes, arguing it gives Rome immense influence over all parts of life, potentially creating fear, spiritual bondage, and undue control over consciences.
And she notes that even French Catholic clergy sometimes denounced the Jesuits.
Correct, for alleged immoral teaching and even idolatrous practices, showing that criticism wasn't just external or Protestant.
Finally, on England, she highlights tensions between secular priests and Jesuits there.
The seculars apparently complained bitterly that Jesuits were disruptive, ambitious, self-serving, and made life harder for all Catholics in England by provoking suspicion.
So, a history marked by conflict and suspicion. As the book concludes, what's Cusack's final message? Her call to vigilance.
She urges readers to understand the real history of Rome and the Jesuits, warning against a false charity that ignores past wrongs. She warns about Jesuit wiles, their adaptability, their alleged use of disguise. It's a strong call to Christians and lovers of freedom to resist what she sees as a church that stifles thought.
She even uses comments from within the church to support her case.
Yes, that anecdote about Pope Pius IX being privately relieved, about monasteries being suppressed in Italy, hinting at internal problems, and Cardinal Newman's famous protest against the aggressive, insolent faction, often interpreted as referring to Jesuit influence.
So her last word is basically, stay alert, understand the history, be critical.
Exactly. A final plea for vigilance and informed skepticism about the Society of Jesus' influence, past and potentially present.
Well, this has certainly been a comprehensive exploration of M.F. Cusack's The Black Pope. A very critical take, indeed. We really encourage you, our listeners, to chew on these historical points and consider their resonance today, if any.
And as always, we'd love it if you join the English BookCast channel. Subscribing, sharing these deep dives, it all helps us keep these conversations going.
Yeah, definitely. And we always encourage you to do your own digging, explore the topics, check out the sources mentioned, form your own informed opinions. That's crucial.
Absolutely. And maybe we can leave you with this thought. Given how power works in big institutions throughout history, how important is it really to maintain that critical eye, that informed perspective, no matter how much things seem to change on the surface?
A great question to ponder. Thank you all so much for joining us for this deep dive. We hope to have you back next time on the English BookCast.